Before we even knew what pain was, we learned how to protect ourselves from it. We smiled when it hurt. We stayed quiet when it mattered. And we built something not a life, but a shelter. This is the story of that shelter, of the masks we wore, of the rooms we locked, of the strength that came from surviving and the softness that came from finally leaving. If you've ever felt like you no longer fit inside your own life, if you've ever whispered, "I want more, but I don't know what more looks like," then this story is for you. Not to tell you who to become, but to remind you, you've been becoming all along. Before you knew what you were doing, you were already building. Not a dream, not a future, but a shelter. You didn't plan it. You didn't choose it. You just needed somewhere to feel safe. And so you started building. You don't remember the exact moment it began. You just remember the weight. The way the world felt too big, too loud, too unpredictable, and how your chest tightened at the sound of footsteps that didn't match your rhythm. You were too young to understand fear as a concept, but you knew it intimately as a sensation. A tightening, a stilling, a silence inside you. So you built, not out of bricks and wood, but out of silence, obedience, apology. You built with every smile that wasn't quite real, every "I'm fine" that was anything but. You built with your achievements, your pleasing, your carefulness. You stacked layers of protection in the form of compliance, performance, perfection. And people clapped. They said you were strong, mature, responsible. They said you were easy. They said you had it all together. No one saw the blueprint that this wasn't a palace of power, but a shelter of survival. You didn't build to be admired. You built to not fall apart. And the house grew quietly, slowly, invisibly, room by room. A room for all the things you couldn't say. A room for the fears you couldn't name. A room for the needs you convinced yourself were too much. A room for the anger that no one allowed you to feel. A room where you tucked away the child in you who just wanted to be held. You filled the walls with shoulds. You decorated with silence. You painted the windows shut so no one could see, and not even you. But from the outside, it looked beautiful, put together, stable, admirable. That's the thing about survival structures. They're often mistaken for success. But they don't breathe. They don't stretch. They don't let in sunlight. And so you stayed inside. Not because it was warm, but because it was familiar. Not because it felt like home, but because it felt safer than the unknown. You learned how to decorate pain, how to organize anxiety, how to schedule breakdowns between responsibilities, how to laugh at the right times, nod at the right places, excel in everything except existing. You forgot what your voice sounded like unfiltered. You forgot what your body felt like when it wasn't bracing. You forgot how to speak without checking for approval. And the scariest part, you got good at it. So good that even you believed the illusion. You mistook survival for strength, control for clarity, achievement for aliveness. But deep down, something still throbbed. Not loudly, but steadily. A kind of ache you couldn't name. Like homesickness for a place you've never been. A whisper in the quiet saying, "This isn't all there is." But you buried it because you were busy, because people needed you, because falling apart wasn't an option, because you didn't know how to live outside the house you built. So you kept building. A stronger door, thicker walls, fewer windows. And you called it boundaries. You called it adulthood. You called it maturity. But the truth is, it was still fear. It was still protection. It was still the little version of you hiding. You didn't need more resilience. You needed permission to rest, to feel, to be. But the house was too loud with rules. Too loud with, don't cry. Too loud with, just be grateful. Too loud with, you're fine, and so you stopped listening to the ache. You convinced yourself it would go away. You told yourself you were too old, too busy, too whatever to fall apart now. But what if falling apart is the beginning of becoming real? What if the house wasn't built to last, only to carry you this far? What if it did its job? And what if now you're allowed to leave? You didn't leave all at once. You started by walking slower through the halls, noticing how dim the light had become. You touched the doorknobs of rooms you hadn't entered in years, rooms filled with memories you swore you'd forgotten. You stood outside them, frozen, heart pounding, unsure whether you wanted to remember or remain numb. But something inside you, quiet, persistent, said, "You need to see," so you opened one door. Just one. And it hit you. The dust of your childhood longing was still floating there. The chair where you used to wait for someone to notice. The books of dreams you once believed in, now stacked beneath years of self-editing and silent endurance. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was quiet, familiar, painfully tender. You walked further in, realizing this wasn't a room of rage, it was a room of absence. You weren't angry. You were starved. Starved of warmth. Starved of truth. Starved of being seen as you were, not as who they needed you to be. You sat down finally. For the first time in what felt like forever, you let the air settle. And in that stillness, the ache spoke. It said, "You abandoned me here, not with cruelty, not with blame, just with the sad honesty of someone who has waited too long to be remembered." You wanted to apologize to yourself, but the apology wasn't needed. What was needed was your return. So you stayed. You breathed. You didn't fix. You didn't clean. You just allowed what had been hidden to come into light. Then you opened another door. This one was heavier. It groaned on its hinges, like it didn't want to let you in. Inside was the part of you who fought to be good, who always did the right thing, who obeyed, smiled, cooperated, who mistook being useful for being loved. And that version of you was exhausted. Her hands were raw from giving. Her smile cracked from being worn too often. She didn't need fixing either. She just needed to be released. So you told her, "You don't have to earn your right to exist," and her shoulders finally dropped. Room by room, you kept going, into the memories of laughter that had edges, into the celebrations where you felt invisible, into the friendships where you gave and gave, and when you had nothing left, they left too. You began to see that this house wasn't evil. It was just built from fear, from adaptation, from the beautiful, heartbreaking genius of a child trying to stay safe. And that child deserved your praise, not your shame. You weren't weak for hiding. You were brave for surviving. You weren't foolish for staying. You were wise for knowing when it was finally time to go. And yet, as you stood in those rooms, you didn't rush, because there was mourning here. Mourning the comfort of the familiar. Mourning the clarity that came from having rules, even if those rules were cages. Mourning the identity you built, the persona, the control, the predictability. Leaving meant losing who you thought you were. And that grief was real. It didn't mean you were going backward. It meant you were shedding. Not burning the house, not condemning it, just gently acknowledging, "This served me." And it no longer does. You saw yourself in the wallpaper, in the cracks, in the corners. You remembered the nights you cried into pillows because no one could handle your truth. You remembered how you kept your dreams quiet because they felt too big to fit into the walls you were raised in. And now you knew Staying was no longer strength. Staying was fear. And love, true love, always invites expansion. So you made a promise to every version of yourself left behind in those rooms. I won't forget you. I won't erase you. But I won't live here anymore. And as you closed the doors, one by one, you weren't locking them again. You were blessing them with gratitude, with reverence, with release, not because you had no more pain, but because you were finally ready to carry it differently, not as armor, but as a reminder of how far you'd come, of what you never want to forget, of who you were and who you're becoming. You stayed in the house because it felt safe. At least, that's what you told yourself. Safety, after all, was the goal. Not joy, not freedom, just not being hurt again. And for a long time, that was enough. Enough to keep you quiet. Enough to keep you agreeable. Enough to keep you from chasing what you truly wanted. You called it boundaries. You called it discernment. But often, it was fear disguised as control, dressed up as wisdom. It was the deep ache of, I never want to feel that again, cemented into the walls of a life that looked neat but felt hollow. And it's so easy to mistake that hollow for peace. You got good at managing things, at minimizing risks, at keeping your world small enough to stay predictable. You trimmed your desires. You edited your voice. You told yourself not to want too much. You learned to celebrate crumbs. Not because you didn't crave more, but because more came with the possibility of loss, of mess, of exposure. And safety? Safety meant not being seen too deeply, because being seen meant being judged, or worse, misunderstood. So you stayed inside the lines. You mastered emotional distance. You became self-sufficient to a fault, and people praised you for it. You're so strong, so low maintenance, so mature, but they didn't see the cost. The nights you couldn't cry because it no longer felt safe. The connections you couldn't deepen because the walls were always in the way. The dreams you abandoned because failure felt too dangerous. The relationships you quietly walked away from, not because they were toxic, but because they touched parts of you that still felt too raw. You didn't build a life. You built a strategy. A beautiful, well-constructed, internally consistent strategy. And it worked. Until it didn't. Until you began to feel like a stranger inside your own existence. Until you realized that nothing bad was happening and yet something still hurt. Until the safety became suffocating. Because that's what happens when survival becomes your identity. At first, it's empowering. Later, it's imprisoning. You start to notice the walls. The predictability no longer comforts, it confines. The routines no longer ground, they numb. The life that once felt like sanctuary now feels like sedation. You're alive, but not living. Breathing, but not expanding. Holding it all together, but forgetting what it's for. And one day, maybe during a quiet afternoon or a conversation that cuts deeper than usual, the realization arrives this safety is costing you your aliveness. You're not protecting your peace. You're preventing your growth. You're not building a future. You're reliving the past in slow motion. You're not free. You're conditioned. You start to see how fear has shaped your choices, not always dramatically, but subtly, constantly. You see how much you've shrunk, how much you've silenced, how much you've given up on, not because it wasn't possible, but because it wasn't safe. And something inside you stirs, a hunger, a grief, a knowing. You don't want this anymore, not at this cost. You want to feel again, even if it's messy, even if it's risky, even if it breaks the illusion you worked so hard to maintain. Because now you understand, safety without a liviness is just another form of fear. And fear, when it becomes your compass, always leads you in circles. So you begin to challenge the house. You question the rules you never agreed to. You open the windows you once painted shut. You feel the wind chaotic, uncontained, and it terrifies you. But also, it thrills you. Because for the first time in a long time, you feel the echo of something real, something wild, something true. You won't tear the house down in a blaze. That's not your way. But you'll leave the door open. You'll stop fixing the cracks. You'll stop repainting over pain. You'll let the silence sit. You'll let the noise in. And in doing so, you'll begin to remember you're not made for confinement. You are made for becoming. There's a strange kind of silence at the threshold, the in-between of who you've been and who you're becoming. It's not the same silence you felt inside the house. That was the silence of containment, of swallowing what you couldn't express. This one is different. It's spacious, expansive, empty in the way the sky is empty, not void, but full of what could be. And it scares you, because no one taught you how to exist without a structure. No one gave you a blueprint for freedom. You were raised on rules. You were shaped by expectations. You were praised for being consistent, for being easy, for staying in your lane. So standing at the edge of this new life, this undefined self feels like disobedience, feels like betrayal, feels like exposure. You wonder who you'll be if you stop apologizing, if you stop editing, if you stop performing the version of you that kept everyone comfortable. And the answer, you don't know. Not yet. That's what makes it the threshold. The unknown, the unfamiliar, the space where the ground feels unstable because it hasn't yet molded to your becoming. There's no applause here, no validation, no external markers of success. Just the quiet question, are you willing to be someone you've never met? Are you willing to be someone who is no longer built from reaction, from protection, from pain? Are you willing to let go of the story where you're the strong one, the quiet one, the one who always keeps it together? Because that story, while familiar, is also limiting. It tells you who you were, not who you could be. And right now in this liminal space, the old story is fading. The house is behind you. The wild is ahead, and you're somewhere in the middle. Alone, untethered, but not lost. No, you're not lost. You're just unanchored from what no longer fits. And that's terrifying, but it's also sacred. This is the moment before the birth, before the clarity, before the words return. This is the part where the soul stretches, where identity dissolves, where you stop asking, who should I be? And begin asking, what feels true in my bones? You may not have the language for it. You may not have the courage for all of it, but you have enough to stay. And that's where it begins. Not with a leap, but with a lingering, a listening, a willingness to not rush back to the familiar just because the unfamiliar is uncomfortable. You will want to run back to structure, back to certainty, back to the walls that held you, even if they also hid you. But you don't. You stay. You breathe. You tremble. You whisper to yourself, this is new. And I'm allowed to be new too. You begin to ask different questions. Not, what will they think? But, what do I need? Not, am I doing this right? But, is this real for me? Not, how do I fit in? But, where do I feel free? And the answers don't come all at once. They unfold, slowly, quietly, like petals in a place that never knew sunlight. You begin to explore. to try, to fail gently, to change your mind without apology. You begin to practice being, without defending, without explaining, without shrinking. And it's awkward, and it's beautiful, and it's raw, but it's yours. You are no longer living a life that was designed for your survival. You are beginning to build one for your expansion. And that changes everything. Because now, when fear rises, and it will, you don't immediately retreat. You breathe with it. You listen to it. You ask what it's trying to protect. You don't silence it. You don't obey it. You hold it. And then you move forward anyway. Slowly, gently, unapologetically. And maybe, for the first time in your life, you feel alive. Not safe. Not impressive. Not perfect. But present. And that presence? That's the beginning of becoming someone you've never been, but always were. You thought the scariest thing would be the leaving, walking out of the house you built, shedding the layers you called identity, choosing the unfamiliar over the illusion of safety. But it wasn't. The leaving was terrifying, yes, but it was also silent, solitary, something only you could witness. The real fear came after, when people began to look at you differently, or worse, look at you and actually see you, because you are no longer hidden behind roles, no longer protected by the labels that gave others comfort, no longer editing your emotions to fit the space. You were just you, and that is terrifying, because now there's nowhere to hide. And being seen doesn't just mean being praised. It means being misread, misunderstood, misused. You fear the gaze that pierces too deep, the one that might notice your uncertainty, your messiness, your not yet figured outness. You fear the moments someone might say, "You've changed," not as a compliment, but as an accusation. And maybe you have changed. Maybe you've stopped being agreeable. Maybe you've started saying no. Maybe your silence no longer feels like peace. Maybe your presence no longer feels like performance. And that unsettles people, the ones who loved the version of you that never asked for much, that never disrupted, that made them feel safe by being small. But you're not small anymore. You're soft, still but not small. You're open, still but not obedient. And that's what scares you. Not that people will reject who you are, but that they'll reject the real you before you even get used to her. Because you're still meeting her too. Still learning what she needs, what she believes, what she will and will not tolerate. And showing up as her, not the curated version, but the real one, feels like standing naked in the middle of a room full of clothed expectations. You want to retreat, to go back to blending in, to go back to being the one who keeps the peace by never disturbing the waters. But you can't, because once you taste authenticity, you can no longer stomach pretense. Once you hear your own voice clearly, the sound of silence feels like self-abandonment. Once you stand in your truth, even shakily, the floor of your old life no longer holds. And so you tremble forward. You speak even when your voice quivers. You stay even when discomfort tells you to run. You breathe even when your body begs to disappear. Because now you know, being seen is a risk, but hiding is a guarantee. A guarantee that you will never be loved for who you are, only for who you pretend to be. And you're done pretending, not because it never worked, but because it never made you feel alive. And you want aliveness now, more than safety, more than acceptance, more than approval. You want connection, the kind that doesn't require performance, the kind that doesn't punish honesty, the kind that says you're allowed to take up space here, as you are, and yes, It's rare. And yes, not everyone will offer it, but you're willing to wait, to hold your truth like a quiet lantern, glowing even in the dark. You're no longer rushing to be understood. You're just committed to being true. And in that commitment, something shifts. The fear of being seen doesn't vanish, but it softens. Because now, you're not looking for everyone to accept you. You're looking for the few who can meet you. In the middle, in the real, in the raw. And in time, you'll find them. Or rather, they'll find you. Not because you shouted, but because your honesty glowed loud enough to be heard. And those who can see you truly see you will stay, not for your performance, but for your presence. And that, you'll learn, is the kind of safety worth waiting for. You were taught that strength was loud, that it roared, conquered, pressed forward no matter the cost. That softness was surrender. That vulnerability was a liability. That being tender made you breakable. So you hardened. You built a shield out of logic, out of humor, out of keeping your distance. You learned to use words as armor, silence as control. You perfected the art of smiling through what hurt. And no one questioned it. They praised it. They called you mature, wise, self-aware. But what they didn't know was that underneath it all, you were tired. Not just physically, soul tired. From carrying what no one saw. From tending to others without tending to yourself. From pretending that holding it all together wasn't costing you everything. You didn't cry much. You didn't fall apart. But not because you didn't want to. Because you didn't feel safe to. Because you didn't know if you'd be able to stop once you started. So you stayed composed, reliable, untouchable. And the world said, "Wow, you're so strong," but you knew. You knew that strength, the kind they praised, was the very thing that kept you from healing. Because true healing doesn't happen in performance. It happens in presence. And presence requires softness. Softness is not weakness. Softness is what allowed the truth to surface. It's what helped you finally admit you were lonely, even surrounded by people. It's what made space for grief that had been sitting in your chest for years. It's what let you feel joy again, not as a reward, but as a right. You began to realize that being gentle with yourself was more courageous than pushing through. That crying wasn't a breakdown, it was a breakthrough. That asking for help wasn't defeat, it was defiance against isolation. And slowly, you let yourself soften. Not all at once. Not dramatically, but in small, almost invisible ways. You paused when you would have pushed. You breathed when you would have braced. You said, "This hurts," instead of, "I'm fine," and in that softness, you found something you'd forgotten how to recognize: safety. Not safety from the world, but safety with yourself. Because now you knew strength without softness is just rigidity. It protects, but it also suffocates. Softness doesn't make you fragile. It makes you whole. It connects you to your body, to your needs, to the wisdom that lives underneath the noise. You stopped seeing emotion as the enemy. You stopped seeing your past as something to erase. You stopped seeing your sensitivity as something to outgrow. Instead, you honored it. You made space for it. You let it lead you gently into the places that still needed tending. And people noticed, not always with words, but with the way they leaned in when you spoke truth without flinching, with the way they softened too in your presence. Because softness is contagious. It invites honesty. It disarms shame. It reminds others that they don't have to be so hard to be respected. And maybe that's your real strength now, not how much you can carry, but how often you choose to put it down. Not how composed you can stay, but how deeply you allow yourself to feel. Not how many times you say, "I'm fine," but how many times you say, "I'm not," and that's okay. You've lived the life of the strong one, and it served you. But now, you're learning to be the whole one, the tender one, the brave one who shows up anyway. You're not fragile. You're full of stories, full of scars, full of softness that has survived fire. And that's not weakness. That's what saved you. There's a quiet grief that comes when you begin to outgrow the version of yourself that kept you alive. No one really talks about it, because growth is supposed to be celebrated. Transformation is supposed to be exciting. But what they don't say is that change often starts with mourning. Not mourning who you could have been, but mourning who you were, the version of you who stayed silent to keep the peace, who shaped herself to be palatable, who made herself small in the hopes of being loved more easily. That version of you wasn't weak. She was brilliant. She knew what she had to do. She read the room. She adapted. She became what was safest to become. And she did it so well, for so long, that you almost forgot it was never truly you. But now, you're waking up. You're noticing how tight it's all become, the way you think, the way you speak, the way you keep showing up in rooms that no longer hold your spirit. And the first reaction isn't liberation. It's loss. Because that identity was your shelter. Your mask was your compass. Your patterns, your autopilot, your certainty. Letting that go feels like dying, not dramatically, but deeply. Because you realize you have to disappoint people. You realize you won't be understood by everyone. You realize some relationships were built with the old you, and the new you doesn't belong there. And that breaks your heart, because you are never pretending maliciously. You are simply surviving. And now, you're choosing something else. And that choice, that sacred, quiet, internal choice, costs you. It costs familiarity. It costs approval. It costs the ease of being what others expected. And in its place, you get space. Vast, unnerving, possibility-filled space. Space that asks you, who are you when you stop performing? What do you love now that you're allowed to choose for yourself? What feels true, not just familiar? And in that space, you begin again. Awkwardly, tenderly, honestly. You grieve the comfort of your past identity while slowly stepping into a self you haven't met yet. And that duality, holding grief in one hand and hope in the other, becomes your new rhythm. You cry for the girl who never said no. You thank the woman who now says yes, only when she means it. You ache for the times you silenced yourself to be accepted. You smile at the moments you speak even when your voice shakes. And little by little, the grief softens. It doesn't vanish. It integrates. It becomes part of your wholeness, not something to get over, but something to grow through. You start to realize that outgrowing yourself isn't abandonment. It's honoring the truth that you're allowed to evolve. That loyalty to your past self is not more important than honesty to your present one. And that shift, that sacred internal realignment, is the beginning of everything. You don't need to know who you're becoming yet. You just need to trust the parts of you that long for more. More depth, more truth, more presence, more softness. You don't need to rush to replace what's ending. You just need to allow yourself to feel the endings fully. Because when you honor what's gone, you make space for what's real to arrive. And what's arriving is you. Not the you they built, not the you protected, but the you that's been whispering from the quiet all along. There's more, and you're allowed to become it. There comes a moment when you realize there is no map, no clear instruction, no master plan handed to you from above to tell you who to become and how to do it. And for someone who spent most of their life following the blueprint, the rules, the shoulds, The expectations that moment can feel disorienting. Because the blueprint gave you structure. It gave you identity. It gave you certainty, even if it cost you your authenticity. It told you what success looked like, what worthiness looked like, what being good looked like. And even if you hated it, even if it made you shrink and ache and hide, it at least made sense. But now that you've left the house, now that you've said no to the life you were taught to want, you're standing in open space. And there's nothing but possibility. No one clapping, no one grading, no one confirming that you're getting it right. Just you. And the truth is, that kind of freedom feels like falling, because you're so used to the walls, so used to the noise, so used to chasing approval as if it were air. Now you wake up and ask yourself, what do I want? Not what should I do? Not what would make others proud. Not what will guarantee I'm seen as successful or smart or stable. Just, what do I want? And it's hard to answer, because you weren't taught to want. You were taught to aim, to perform, to produce. You were taught to shape yourself to fit a role, not to ask what shape your soul actually longs to take. So you begin slowly, tentatively. You explore joy not as a reward, but as a compass. You let yourself rest without earning it. You let curiosity lead instead of pressure. And it's awkward. It's clumsy. It feels inefficient. Because living outside the blueprint isn't linear. It's cyclical, spiral-like. Some days you feel clear. Other days you feel lost. Some moments you feel expansive. Others you feel scared and small and tempted to go back. Back to the familiar metrics. Back to the version of you who had answers even if those answers weren't yours. But you don't. Because now, you're learning to live from the inside out. You're learning that clarity doesn't come from control. It comes from alignment, from listening, from learning how to feel your way forward without needing to justify every step. You let your body speak. You let your instincts guide. You let your heart be heard, even when it says things that don't make sense yet. And slowly, you begin to trust yourself. Not because you're always right, but because you're willing to be real. You no longer need to explain your pace. You no longer apologize for your path. You start to see your life as a canvas, not a checklist, something that's being created, not measured. And that shift, that holy rebellion against the blueprint, becomes your liberation. You notice beauty more. You let joy surprise you. You stop bracing for disappointment. You stop rehearsing how to make your life acceptable. Because it's no longer about being acceptable. It's about being alive. Fully, honestly, softly. You may not know exactly where you're going. But you do know this. The moment you left the blueprint behind was the moment you began living. Not for anyone else. Not through anyone else. But as yourself. And that is more than enough. You spent so much of your life trying to belong. To family. To friends. To culture. To systems that weren't built with your heart in mind. You shaped yourself to be accepted. You wore the masks, played the parts, stayed quiet when your soul screamed, just so you wouldn't be alone. Because back then, alone felt like failure, like something was wrong with you, like rejection meant you were broken. So you became good at contorting, at making yourself easier to love by being less yourself. And they called you selfless, empathic, humble. But what they didn't see was the erosion. The way your own sense of self grew thinner with each compromise. The way your voice became a whisper even you stopped hearing. The way your worth got tied to how useful, agreeable, or convenient you could be. You weren't belonging. You were bargaining, and it cost you. It cost you your depth, your truth, your joy. Because real belonging doesn't ask you to disappear. It doesn't require perfection. It doesn't punish your boundaries or your needs. Real belonging begins with you belonging to yourself first. And that's the part no one taught you. That's the part you had to unlearn. That your worth is not in your usefulness. That your value is not in your visibility. That being loved should never cost you your soul. So you start the slow, radical act of choosing yourself. Not in defiance, not in revenge, but in reverence. You start asking, what do I need? What do I want to say, even if it shakes my voice? What does honesty feel like in my body, even if it scares me? And you listen, not to the noise, but to the truth you buried to survive. You let her rise. And yes, it's lonely at first, because the people who only loved the version of you that was easy, they begin to drift. Not because you're wrong, but because you're different. Because you're rooted now. Because you won't bend the way you used to. And that unsettles those who depended on your flexibility. But it frees you, because now you belong to yourself. You eat when you're hungry. You rest when you're tired. You speak when something matters. You walk away when something hurts too much. You say yes with your whole being, or not at all. You become your own home. And from that place, that inner steadiness, something beautiful begins to happen. You attract differently, not because you're trying, but because your energy no longer whispers desperation. It radiates wholeness. You no longer seek love to complete you. You seek connection that reflects your truth. You no longer shapeshift to be chosen. You walk as yourself and trust that the right ones will see you. You no longer mistake being alone for being unworthy, because solitude now feels sacred. It feels like space to breathe, to return, to remember. You stop proving. You stop performing. You just exist fully, freely, fiercely. And that in itself becomes the invitation, the magnet, the medicine. You belong to yourself first, not as a last resort, but as a foundation. And in that belonging, everything changes. You stop chasing rooms that don't fit you. You stop asking for permission to take up space. You stop editing your light to soothe other people's shadows. You begin to trust that you don't have to explain your healing. You don't have to apologize for your clarity. You don't have to make sense to people committed to misunderstanding you. You just have to stay true. And when you do, when you finally come home to yourself, the loneliness fades. Not because you've found everyone who will love you, but because you've stopped abandoning yourself to be loved. You look back now and realize you were never lost. You were unfolding, becoming, quietly, awkwardly, beautifully, painfully. Every detour had purpose. Every ache was a messenger. Every pause a lesson. And the house you built, the one that kept you small, safe, silent, it wasn't failure. It was sacred, because it held the version of you who needed it. It carried you through storms. It gave you structure when everything else felt like chaos. But it was never meant to be your forever, just your beginning. And now, you see that clearly. You're not angry at who you were. You're grateful, because you survived the things that no one clapped for. You carried the weight no one saw. You smiled when it would have been easier to disappear. That's not weakness. That's resilience in its quietest, purest form. And now, standing outside the walls you once called home, you breathe deeper. Your chest doesn't feel tight the way it used to. Your body doesn't flinch at softness. Your soul isn't asking to be fixed, it's asking to be trusted. Because what you've found isn't a destination. It's a rhythm. a relationship with yourself that doesn't demand performance, a way of living that honors your truth more than your image. And in this new space, you realize something even more powerful. There is no final version of you. There is only the unfolding, the deepening, the remembering. And that is a kind of peace the old you never knew existed. You stop chasing becoming someone else. You start embracing the becoming of more of you. You start choosing stillness over certainty, curiosity over control, integrity over approval. You understand now that healing isn't a place you arrive at. It's how you walk, with gentleness, with presence, with the quiet confidence of someone who has survived themselves and come back with grace. And the world still spins. The voices still shout. The expectations still echo. But they don't hold the same power anymore. Because you know who you are when no one is looking. You know how to come back to yourself when the noise gets loud. You know how to choose rest over running, truth over pleasing, softness over self-abandonment. And that knowing that inner steadiness is what makes you unshakable. Not hard, not untouchable, but deeply rooted, alive, whole. And so you walk forward, not because the path is certain, but because you are. You walk with open hands, open eyes, and an open heart. You walk not as someone who has it all figured out, but as someone who is finally okay not knowing. Because the not knowing no longer means you're lost. It means you're living fully, freely, authentically. You forgive the seasons where you stayed too long. You bless the version of you that didn't yet know how to leave. You smile at the one who kept it all together and whisper, "You don't have to anymore." You let yourself be held by the truth you spent years trying to earn. You're always enough. And now, finally, you're ready to live like it. You don't need to prove. You don't need to hide. You just need to keep becoming. With softness, with courage, with the unshakable knowing that you are no longer surviving. You are free, and you were never lost. Only becoming. You are never broken, only buried. Never too far gone, only far from yourself. The house you built to survive did its job, but you don't have to live there anymore. So step softly. Let the walls crumble where they must, and keep walking toward the light only you can see. Because this isn't about rebuilding. It's about remembering. And remembering is how we come home.